Okay, welcome everyone. Really excited to launch our first face-to-face seminar. I'm really excited to have Eric here, who has traveled from Norway for the first time after the pandemic.
So, first time for me. A long time.
It's a great pleasure to have Eric here. Eric is one of my PhD heroes. You know, he's one of the guys that I looked up to when I was doing my PhD. Certainly infrastructure studies. I feel very, honored to have him here. And of course, you all know him. You know his work. Computer scientist by training, but more sociologically oriented in his studies. Spearheading ANT in IS, and more recently, his more recent work with digital oil companies in the North Sea, and looking at the use of digital technologies to understand data collected from the seafloor, but also other types of data. And he's working currently on a book, but also building from a number of papers that have appeared in recent years. So Eric, really, this is a pleasure to have you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Panos, and thanks for having me. I mean, this is also I've fallen completely out of the habit of doing this, so bear with me if I'm a little rusty here. But as Panos was saying, this is a stream of work from building on 10+ years of studies in this domain, and I'll get into what I have to say here. But just to for those who interested in that, I also have other streams of work which I won't cover today, particularly in healthcare and the public sector. And the way that works, which I'm happy to talk about at one point, is I think that it's a kind of triangulation between two deep streams of empiric work so there is a kind of which notions and concepts float across and carry across from very different domains. Obviously they are different. So and this is really what I'll talk about is as Paul says, a series of papers, and I can you can probably Google them, but they're built up in a particular way, and make their way into a book that is coming out this year with the same title for MIT Press. So with that, let me get into it. The first one.
Yeah, if you click on the screen, it should allow you to.
No, it should work. The keyboard. Yeah. The first thing to comment on, I think, anywhere in the world, it's not that long since the COP, up in Glasgow. The why on earth talk about oil when most of the world seemed to be more interested in, for good reasons, the climate change, which gets realer, but more and more real by the hour or the day. So what on earth could be good reasons to get into to study this domain? I think that certainly warrants some proper a proper response. And my attempted response then is that I see three good reasons. One is that, as I'll get into, this study of the digitalization of offshore oil and gas industries is a vivid illustration of what has numerous, names, Industry 4.0, industrial IoT, the way different from all the studies of social media and advertisement, finance, bank, looks at manufacturing, process industry, the transformation of industrial work. And as will be clear in a moment, the very central role that sensors play in exactly that. And this is something I'll get back to. But I take this to be one important motivation. The other is I'm really interested in how the professionals that I'll talk about, geologists, the so-called subsurface community of some 15 different types of production engineers, process engineers, reservoir engineers, geologists, geophysics, petrochemists, and the list goes on. How they know what they need to know in the corporate setting, which is very different from academic settings. So we get into the pragmatics of this, where they are happy with imperfections and good enough answers, and how does this shape their operational decision making. And I think this what Neil Pollack calls business epistemology. How is it that professionals with a strong scientific identity, but trapped in a corporate operational environment, how do they juggle their different commitments? And lastly, this is political, and I would want to include rather than dismiss this, this politics. So then this is, this list would then be, the poor excuse for, delving into this domain. What I'll talk about then is essentially this. How do we get from, roughnecks, manual, wear and tear, to situation which is, the image is poor, but you get the point. Which often gets I think mistakenly easily just wrapped up as digital transformation. This is not smooth and frictionless and instant. This is something that's happened over years, not to say decades, and the role of technology is central to understanding what is happening here. And there are a number of stories or narratives or aspects or whatever you want to call them around this, which I, for most of them, will not touch in this talk. I will, address it in the guide, but one is kind of institutional learning. That's the story in which Norwegian, both government and parliament and industrial actors recognize that at the beginning, which is early 70s, late 60s, we know absolutely nothing about oil and gas. How is it, how will we build a robust industrial cluster? And the key here was to set in place institutional arrangements for slow enough learning so that the existing industry was able to morph into what is now a very significant industrial cluster. That's the long story in itself, but you know, it's very, very different from also close neighbors such as Denmark, which went with the classic, you know, we just auction out the various bits and pieces and leave it to, well, essentially the Americans, and then the UK doing something very similar. So there is an institutional story here that I'll have to just, I'm happy to take any questions, but I will basically not, you know, delve into, you know, the unions, the role of the unions. Again, the Americans with their tradition of union busting and you know, set into a deeply, you know, social democratic setting where, and the way, you know, unions make their way into the story, with safety being a very prominent vehicle, you know, arguments about what changes are safe to make. 6 months before the Deepwater Horizon, there was an event which didn't catch much attention on the Norwegian continental shelf, which was this far from the same level of disaster as. So, and similarly, you know, industrial clusters transforming centuries of old maritime industries into oil service. By now, 10 times the workforce of what people associate with oil, which are oil operators. So there is a lot to be said about the ecosystem of economic. There is the story about digital platforms, which I will slightly come back to. The gist of it being that I think, different from what most of us, as in, say, IS, but also the social scientists, the case studies. I think there is a new unit of analysis. I think the unit of analysis no longer is within the individual companies and organizations. It's more at the level of whole domains and industries. And the digital platforms come in as a vehicle for changing the whole domain rather than the individual. That has some very profound implications for both how we do our studies, but also what we look for. But the main story is the one on embodied work. You know, this image I had, you know, from the one to the next. And I don't know who's old enough, I guess, to have read, you know, Zubov's ancient work on you know, transformation of work. But you know, she was early to you know, point out the importance of how much of industrial work was embodied. She had these stories of people, you know, pulp mill workers dipping their fingers into the pulp, you know, feeling it, smelling it, tasting it, you know, texture, temperature, all of that tactile went into competently operating that mill. And that's exactly what is being challenged. And this is where, you know, sensors come in as ways in which this is challenged. What I will do is to, so, and I need to sort of speed up a little here. I do want to understand efforts of digitalization essentially as attempted quantification. The word attempted is important because it's not necessarily successful. It's, you know, attempted in the sense that capturing the embodied work through sensors definitely, you know, is definitely different, but it approximates some of the the same qualities. So in other words, I will be interested in the, understanding the digital and digital representations, simulations, models, visualizations in different ways, as real as the real stuff, because for all practical purposes, that's what they work with. Much of the stuff that I'll get to are literally, untouchable. They're, 5 kilometers below the seabed. There is no easy way you can just touch and feel what I will talk about. So this is the anthropologist Tom Bolstorff who points out that, so the challenge isn't to get hung up on the real versus the digital, but follow it in its consequences. If people, if it quacks like a duck, walks like a duck, what's the missing? It is a duck. That's the, I forget exactly how that works, but you know I don't want to follow this in 3 different along 3 different strands, 3 different connotations of this quantification. One is that the stuff that is being quantified is expanding. This is where the IoT comes in as a principle. People talk about datafication. So the Zuboff's tasting, smelling is not necessarily per definition outside the scope of what can be quantified. What the sensor literally does is to make that available for further manipulation. The data-driven modes of knowing and the platforms or the machineries of knowing. I will, I'll talk about them. Need to keep an eye on the watcher. I'm aiming for 45 minutes so that we can have time for some questions and comments. Is to follow these 3 aspects of quantification into 3 different cases, which all are 3 different papers. So those who were interested could look up the basic the papers. I'll give a short version here, but they are then specifically about the stuff, and specifically I'll talk about sand. So literally, sand. How does sand become digital? And what are the consequences of basically dealing with it in its digital representations rather than its physical manifestations? Is there a difference? And if so, what? I'll talk about data-driven modes of knowing, and then specifically I'm looking at that phase, which is called exploration, finding the stuff. So basically what they do is that they build models like this. This is one of the oil reservoirs off Trondheim, where I live, halfway up. They build, they gradually refine and elaborate 3D, not to say 4D, simulation models of the hydrocarbon reservoirs. And how could they do this as long as it's, as I say, are miles and miles out of reach? And then I'll talk about a case of knowing where there's a platform aimed to capture knowledge about the marine environment, and specifically cold water corals, which is this Lophelia pedusa, which is its poor image, but out, off the coast of Norway is the richest colony of cold water corals in the world. So monitoring, that aspect of the marine environment has been a source of concern and attention. So I'll talk about that. I will have to give you, the 30-second, crash course in oil and gas and data. So, just bear with me to just give you the tiniest of overview. So basically, the short version of this is that all stages of this activity, that is exploration, finding the stuff, getting at it, and then producing it. All phases, all stages are intensively, data generated. So there is lots and lots and lots of data coming from various sensor-based sources. So, for instance, in the early stage, it's what's called seismic data, which is acoustic, a bit like a radar. So you shoot off acoustic waves into the underground, and then the reflection you read off as you would with a radar. During when you've gotten to the stage of actually drilling a well, there are equipment and sensors that you bring into the well to read off. So who knows why? Why is it not a good idea to go swimming in a lightning storm? Does anyone know? Or maybe you all go swimming in a lightning storm. I mean, because so this was Schlumberger's start. Well, you shouldn't go because water is much more, what's the phrase, conducive of electricity. There is relatively low electrical resistance as compared to hydrocarbons, which have much. And then this was the Schlumberger brothers' observation, which means that when you lower a measurement of electric resistivity down into the hole, you can solve the practical problem of what kind of fluid are the rocks that you go through saturated with. Is it water or is it hydrocarbons? Because the indication given by electric resistivity, by now you have expanded that to nuclear radiation and various other densities, other measurements, which operate in the same thing. They are indicative of certain geological aspects that is relevant, and so on, which end up with drowning in data. I didn't mention that one aspect of this institutional learning is that on the Norwegian continental shelf, that is the Norwegian part, not the UK or the Danish part, all this data is open data. So in principle, everything that everyone produces of this data is available to everyone. Very, very different from the private corporate setting where the ones who acquired the data own the data. So this was one of the institutional arrangements set in place to facilitate so three different types of data would be seismics, the acoustics, these logs, and then when you get to production, you have various monitoring. So a typical field would have tens of thousands of sensors. It's a massively instrumented thing. That is the backdrop of knowing what's happening. Let me just skip this. I will then say or explain each of these three, the sand, the reservoir, and the corals. Why is sand relevant to look at all? Well, it's a big safety hazard. Most of the oil and gas on the Norwegian shelf is in Jurassic sandstone, which means that you produce the oil and gas from sandstone, which means that when you soak up the oil, it's very easily, it's part of the game, the risk of them also getting sand. And sand, like sand blowing, is not something you want, but because at high speeds it can wreak havoc with every part of the equipment and lead to nasty situations. So you want to keep, to make sure that you pick up if these streams are produced oil and gas contain sand to avoid something like this. I talked about the measurements. So one of the things I'll do now is to illustrate how they moved from physical sample taking to capture sand. Pick up, take samples and then run off to the laboratory to see if there is sand, and turn it into digital representations. The overall concern here is for everything about when we move from the physical, in this case sand, to what is going to stand in for sand, is how does this become meaningful at all? Why is it not? I don't know who ever read the Hitchhiker's Guide, but there was this question of what's the meaning of life and everything, life, the universe, and everything, and then eventually the answer is 42, which is completely meaningless. So how is it that these representations gain significance? Why are they not just 42 up on the screen and ridiculously meaningless? They're just bright flashes on the screen. Why do you act upon them? And the pragmatic way of thinking is that this is the Bolstorff's quote: they become real if people act upon them as if it was real sand. And that's what happens. And how do you get to that? Well, I think I'll have to skip this. Motivation was that you are complied by law to have these monitoring for sand because it's a safety hazard. So there is no way out of it. The question is how to do it. And the present way is time-consuming, slow, manual. There are time delays before the sample taking and you get the results back. So it was targeted as a task for digitalization for efficiency reasons, traditional efficiency reasons. This is part of cost cutting, rationalization, the very normal corporate reasons, nothing out of the ordinary. The question, the problem, of course, was not running into this 42 syndrome, to produce ways to represent, sand that were meaningless. And specifically, there was, two different sensor designs, two ways of capturing, sand, which was either, acoustic. So basically, if you have, flow of hydrocarbons and there are particles of sand, and if you have a strobe that picks up, it hits a surface, and it goes ding, there are, it emits a sound. So you pick up on the acoustics because that's different from just the flow. Or which was the one design. The other was that sand will erode strobe in a particular way, which will change its electric resistance properties. So you would measure that. So two indications of sand. But how do you trust it? How do you, why would these readings be more meaningful than 42? And they couldn't do that by, just declaring, please trust it. They were running through scenarios of false alarms. So with the first designs, the first thing that happened was that they, turned off the alarms. They ignored it because they were, their predictions were effectively, inaccurate. They had numerous, false positives, where, yeah.
So can't they triangulate, like, what sensors which measure different things, and then?
That's exactly what they did. So what and I see my timekeeping isn't brilliant, but so I will have to fast forward a little bit. But that's exactly, they struggle with this, and what they do is that they get into ways, operational ways of triangulating, because adding credibility yeah, I wanted to say something which I think we can pick up in the discussion about the significance of different types of errors, of false positives and false negatives, and they have different operational significances, because if you get so many that they simply turn off the alarms, then you're back to flying in dark. Yes, please.
Eric, would it be reasonable to say that there is a parallel between this process that you're explaining and metrology, the science of trying to represent what a kilogram is or what a unit of temperature is?
Yeah.
And all the instrumentation that comes associated with it.
Thanks for that, because that's precisely to the point, and it's not something I will comment directly on, but I don't know if you ever read O'Connor's old history of the calibration of exactly what you're talking about, that to get at because there is no agreed upon measurements of sand. So it was exactly this problem of meteorology. I can't say
Meteorology.
Meteorology. Where to get at it, you need to calibrate the measurement devices and procedures for circulating it, so that we arrive at a standard way of understanding sand. So yes, that is a very perceptive comment. But here there is a whole negotiation of getting it wrong, but some errors and some predictions are more consequential in its operational. So yeah, I'll skip this, I think. Going back to this, and I'll just indicate it, is that we call it tethering, this triangulation. So there are, they have already, they had at specified intervals, they did shutdowns and particular tests. So what they did was that they piggybacked calibration for sand as expanded the routine that they already had for routine safety maintenance with sand, and by doing so got the calibration, the triangulation between, was it the predicted sand, wasn't that really sand? So over time, by doing so, that increased the trustworthiness of this. Yeah, there are lots of of quotes and details that you don't really have to read here, but it was also tied to, related to triangulation, was that individual measurements regularly are wrong. I forgot to say the obvious thing, that this all starts with the recognition that all we have is sensors. And at the same time, what we know about sensors is that they're always wrong. They never get it right. I mean, either they're not working at all, or they're off calibration, or there are some hiccups. So they have these, living with this chronically imperfect data, and as part of that, spikes and outliers, you would regularly just, ignore. So we were looking for trends over time and trajectories more than individual. So all of these together over time with trial and error added up to a situation where they then used it for cutover purposes. They used it to, these indications, this digital SAN was then used as a cutoff vehicle, where you would monitor a number, 100 of wells, and you would use these crude measurements, this indication of something was troubling, to say that these 80 are fine, we don't have to look at it. But for these 20, they weren't closed for inspection. But the inspection itself was then tied to physical sample making. But still, there is so in this sense, it's both that it doesn't outcompete or completely replace everything that was done qualitatively, but 80% of it went. So it's this hybrid situation where for 80% of the wells they did do away with them, but still there are this. I see that I haven't, I might have some qualities, but timekeeping is not high on that. So I will, I think outline, the key points I want to make with these two. So that was SAN. I want to get the reservoirs and corals. The backdrop here is what I'm sure everyone has seen, this data-driven, no theory, it's all induction. Even into, you don't have to read Wired to get that this is piece of science. So that's out there. There are also these examples. This is radiology, which is that area of medical image processing which has received the most attention, and you have regular contests. This is from Nature. So they have these annual contests where you test the algorithms for diagnosing based on radiology images with trained physicians, and the humans are out-competed. So it's that, but I think this line of that story misses very, very important elements. For instance, this have you heard of these contests or something similar? I mean, they run in different.
But there's a flip side to this, right? That the plane that landed on the Hudson, and then the algorithm was telling not to land the plane, and then he put a lot of flags. So I mean,
there are indeed exceptions, and I think the one I would want to draw attention to is that these. This way of setting, so there are details about the exact results here, but if you translate that back into an organizational setting, what does these competitions and these measurements performance measurements mean? Well, they mean that you compare an algorithm which classifies an image based on the data on the screen with, a trained physician staring at that screen, trying to say yes or no, and you get these results. But what that misses, and I think, I argue in this paper that I'll allude to, is that completely misses the way in which uncertainty about these diagnoses or these classification schemes are part of the everyday routine, in the sense that whenever a physician, staring at the screen is uncertain, he or she won't ultimately sit back and I have to make a decision and I'll go up or down. What happens is that you go back to older images, additional data. You consult with your peers, and you acknowledge, that degree of uncertainty, and that is taken forward in the clinical decision making. So it's never, ironed out, and you have to, knife against your throat. You have to say yes or no. This is a very, very artificial way of setting up the competition, and it's deeply unfair to. So it's apples and pears, basically, to put it very simply. And we could talk about, uncertainties about labeling. So this is an example from. The images aren't great. That's part of they're not as bad as I show them here, but you could look up, in the paper. But the point is that they are unclear, and people have uncertainties about what correct labeling would be. But for most of the supervised learning algorithms used in radiology, they purge this and force the algorithm to have no ambiguity in their labeling. So, how do you deal with noisy labels or uncertainties in the labeling? And that is part of the clinical practice. That is why this uncertainty is there all the way. And that's exactly, that sense is exactly what we then find in this study when we look at our geologists who are looking into exploration, which is this, finding this stuff. So literally, there are vast areas where you have very scant data. You might have a well, way over there, and you have seismic, very, very crude. So the point about seismic is that it covers very large areas, but its granularity is poor. It would miss details inside this building. So, big office space, and anyone who knows geology knows that, there are a lot of stuff that happens on the micro level. So granularity is extremely poor, but it covers wide areas. And then you have very detailed measurements, but they're not here where you're interested. They're way over there. So how do you sort of, reconcile details slightly irrelevant because they're, outside, with highly relevant but poor data of what you're really looking at? That's the problem that these geologists have. And they're then looking for I should probably skip the geology here, but basically to have so-called conventional, non-conventionals are different, but so-called conventional oil and gas, you need three things. You need a generation. You need old seabed. That's basically the North Sea. So in Jurassic time, the North Sea was what is now outside of Africa, tropical sea, lush with lots of plankton. That's basically where our hydrocarbons come from. You need a migration path that is typically a fault line, which allow you for transportation. And then the most important thing, you need a cap. You need, to capture it. 90+% of all hydrocarbons just evaporate. So it needs to be a sealing, a cork, something like this. So this is a plane, geological conditions where, and you look for this needle in the in the haystack of wide areas. That's in a nutshell what they do, and they then navigate with very high degrees of uncertainties, drilling. That is, the proof is in the eating, but drilling one well is in the neighborhood of 100 million UK pounds, which means that even in a business with considerable budgets, drilling is costly. So the proof is in the eating, but you have to delay it until you are really certain. And then even so, the hit ratio for drilling is in the neighborhood of 5%. That's a typical figure. Every 20th well you drive, so 19 out of 20 you get wrong, even with all this. That's the level of uncertainty in this. And then we have the ones interested in the long. We talk about how they through these stages, because drilling is costly, you push it back years. So what is it that so until you do that, what you have is the here the seismic, which is poor, and the slightly irrelevant detailed ones, and you try to sort of feed that into the models, and basically then I think I'll in the interest of time skip the details, but you can look them up in the papers. We look at how they work, data driven by essentially accumulating, backing up an existing hypothesis model, framed in a model. So they patch together the data which supports their main hypothesis, which then regulate, so these three things, patterns, they overlap. But then, occasionally this conservative approach gets punctuated by being challenged by, say, a new well over here or a new seismic reading, which upsets. So you try to sort of to pull, as it were, the data you have by its hair to make it fit, force fitting the data, and you're quite creative and robust, tolerant to how much you're accommodating, but there are limits, and then everything is up in the air, and you refactor the model. And lastly, there are, again, for those I've done some studies of medical work and physicians, and this is very recognizable. You're always open to competing. You could have gotten it completely wrong. In medicine, you have, I don't know what they are called in English, supplementary diagnosis. So you have a main diagnosis, and then you should always have supplementary. So you have institutionalized critical thinking in the way of competing in interpretations of what you have, to make sure that you're not, you don't marry one particular one, that you're open to new evidence. So they have these, and these three processes then go over time and add up to yeah. So I'll skip this. What I'd like to talk about then is the corals, and specifically the platform, or what I call the machineries underpinning how we can know the marine environment. Was that a No, sorry. Just scratching your head. Always, always James at the seminar, without sounding too naive, it is slightly naive, but at the same time, it's not completely naive. Norwegian policy on oil and gas is so-called knowledge-based. Of course, we all know that's a joke at one level, but it is also real in the way, this is part of the conversation, and specifically, this has meant that, and I'm sorry for those who have very, vague notions of Norwegian geography. I'll show you a couple of maps, and so it's this long, thing might have seen on the map, and so the 62nd latitude is here. I live up here. So for a long time, all oil and gas was banned north of the 62nd latitude. Why? Because the knowledge-based decisions were, we didn't know enough about, weather conditions, geography, safety, fishery. Fishing is the second largest export, industry. So, fishing is big. And being off limits then meant delaying activities until you so-called had the competence, the practices, the safety measurements in place. So this was back in the was lifted sometime, I forget, in the 80s or early 90s. The ongoing conflict, and let's not get into the Ukraine-Russia thing, but it is actually an analogy which is quite close, because for 40 years, Norway and Russia negotiated the border, on the continental shelf. And after 40 years of negotiation, they finally agreed not that long ago. Norway has had a complicated relationship with Russia all along, but at the same time, there is, especially up north, there is a very, very deep sentiment of, they are our brothers. So following the Second World War, the Russians were the ones who liberated Norway, basically, from the north, the only place where they afterwards, called back. But there is this feeling that there's been trade and all kinds of exchanges for years and years. So it's let me just say, we have a long history of navigating complicated relationships without unnecessarily provoking, which I think is what's happening now. But that's I think we need to do on the pub. But anyway, this then leads to the generating the required knowledge about the marine and the especially up north towards the Russian border, sensitive and highly politicized areas. So the overall, very much like the example I just gave by Sam, is that by law, all operations have to monitor the climate impact on the environment. So they do sample taking, they see if there are oil spills and various disturbances. Same story again. You have to do it. It's traditionally manual, costly, time consuming, etc., etc. Let's rationalize it through digitalization. And again, specifically real time, that is IoT measured aspects. The first and immediate point then is Yeah, sorry, and one more element. You know, we have people in the audience who've been, you know, tourists up to there, and so you might recognize this, but this is so the most you know, politically controversial area for oil and gas is that, because this is still off limits, exactly like the 62nd latitude, because this is the richest, you know, fishing ground on Earth. You know, after they killed off you know, Newfoundland and Arctic cod, you know, all so-called pelagic, that is migrating cod, come in here and spawn, and it's a, you know, it's been you know, for you know, 1,000 years people have you know, come up here. It's decent fishing exactly this time of the year, January, April, every year. But so for that reason, very, very harsh conflicts between, you know, fishing and fishing industry, tourism also, because it's a nice spot if you ever come, and oil and gas, and then the potential for this going wrong. So there is, you know, the lobbying from the oil and gas that they are. You know, the 25% of unexplored oil is expected to be in the Arctic. That's the estimate. So there is a very significant incentive if you forget everything about the, you know, the climate and keep it in the ground. From the purely corporate point of view, there are some very obvious, you know, incentives. But as I say, off limits, deeply conflictual. And how do they maneuver to set in place a kind of knowledge-based policy? What does that mean for continuous monitoring of the marine environment? Well, it means you know, instrumenting the seabed with various you know, measurement devices which select aspects of the marine environment. Because what is the environment? It's everything, literally. So to capture it, that is to represent it, if you want to monitor it, you will have to select certain aspects of the environment which you then try to monitor. And so there is a, again, you can read the longer version here, but there is a negotiation between what is, you know, from, we want essentially everything. For practical, economic, technical reasons, you have to be selective, you can't get it all. So which aspects is it that win out and get represented? And also the interest of the fishery. You know, there are different ways of detecting different species of fish, etc., etc. And this cold water coral, which is a particularly vulnerable species, which then gets monitored. And again, this is not easy to see. The idea is that what the implication of that is that by you know, if you wanted to have an activity or drilling even in an area with coral reefs, if you knew where they were, you could install, you know, by now you drill not downwards, but you drill sideways, even up. So you can start from every and you know, end up here inside a box of 50 meters or something. I mean, the accuracy is quite good. And you can avoid drill cuts because the hole is like this, but if it's, you know, 5 kilometers down, you still get quite a bit of material which then gets dispersed around, you know, pollution, and you want to make sure that that doesn't upset the corals. Let me wrap up.
Yeah.
I think all in all, so what I've tried to do is to say that digitalization is an attempt of quantification. You get it wrong, you screw up, you miss, but over time you have some interesting results. 80% of the wells, but not the last 20. 80% is still interesting level of results. So what are some key issues with this? Well, one is that datafication. Everything is a vector. It's all data. Yes, but how is it that these imperfect version of the real thing captured in the data you have are still useful and meaningful organizational? The conditions. The example of the sand was that it wasn't by staring at the measurements, but it was by this process over time of gaining credibility. So piecemeal, and hybrid. And I think that by implication also is something to keep in mind, not only for the sand, but for other cases and attempts. Here, and this is what we've been on to for a while, Panos, is the data driven, and I think there is no way without getting into the nature of the tasks. I spoke a little bit at least about the nature where with high degrees of uncertainties, which is a way to not just go with it, this push, this outcry for data driven, but understanding the nature of the tasks more specifically. And the one I dwelled on today is high on uncertainty, that being a very prominent quality of that task. And again, I think when we get into cases and examples, we should be very careful to not just heavy-handed brush it one way or the other, but understand the characteristics of the task in some there is also something about AI that I'll talk about. And then the very, very last is, I think, I think that this, and I know I didn't get here now today a chance to elaborate it, but there are examples where I think more and more the significance of this of digital platforms in various, and they of course come in all kinds of shapes and colors. This quote where too much has been on the organizational level, and I think it's a call to spend more time looking at whole industry-wide transformation processes and the platforms as part of that. Of course, there are some very prominent examples of advertisement. There are some people in marketing here, but also finance and EU, PSD2 type of directorates. And I think that would be adding to our concept of. I'll stop there. There is this which I alluded to.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you very much. Just as a note to everyone, this is being recorded, and the Zoom recording will be made available on the website. So please, the floor is open for questions or comments.
I had two comments. One of the most fascinating thing I found in the presentation and in general about the research you're doing is that you are getting to the heart of so to say, the datafication of physical objects which exist out there in the real world. While many of us, including me, what we are trying to theorize about how it is different when we think of, for example, when we are using data from which are generated in the social world, they don't necessarily represent the real physical objects, right? And what we are finding is the uncertainties in the physical world itself, which is fascinating, because it's easier to say the uncertainties and ambiguities in the social world, but it's not as easy to claim and demonstrate the uncertainties in the physical world which you are doing. So that fascinates me. The second thing I was trying to understand, or again, a comment is, when we think of decision making, right, and when we think of how professionals make decisions, like medical professionals, I think the way they make decisions is by embracing the uncertainties and living with the uncertainties. While what we are trying to do with digitization is to alleviate uncertainties, and I think there is an inherent disconnect there, and that's why the black and white versus the gray area of the decision making is something which comes across from your perspective.
Thanks for that. I couldn't have said that better myself. I do think that we all too often end up in this black and white, whereas I think all the real interesting stuff is in the shades of gray. You know, the way, you know, it isn't as clear cut. This example of sand where so it's not 100%. It doesn't, you know, completely take over the physical, but 80%, and I'm sure over time, you know, things will change. So I think this is what I mean by the hybrids and the piecemeal, and I think that, you know, that to me is the gray, and we should be looking into the shades of gray. And yes, I also think that you know, too much is on the black and the white. So it's in relative terms too few, you know, dwell on that gray area. The thing on the physical, yes, but at the same, you know, so, you know, take the likes and the buttons and you know, so it gets at sentiments or attitudes or whatever you want to call them. And I think in this, you know, the similarity with the sand and the corals and all I've talked about is that I'm not so interested in you know, wood, you know, monitoring, you know, 1500 like buttons. Does that really capture your sentiment? Is that really the sentiment? So I'm not. And similarly, is this really sand, what I'm staring at the screen? I think, to me, that's the kind of ontological question of okay, so what is sand and what is sentiment? To me, I find that, you know, that inquiry, you know, slightly boring, to be honest. I think the much more interesting is, I don't really care what sentiment is, but, you know, advertisers and others act upon approximations, attempted quantification of sentiments to push ads, or in my case, make decisions. So in this sense, it doesn't matter whether or not it's the real sentiments or not. I mean, for the purpose of advertisement or monitoring sand, it is sand or sentiment. And of course, that approximation breaks down because, you know, you get to points where so for 80% it works, and 20%. So we get the same, you know, story where it's really, you know, attempts to, you know, capture more, which is in the realm of the qualitative. You never get it, you know, 100%. But I think the approximations are increasingly interesting. And they are also make organizational sense. You know, so this case of the 80%, to get back to this one, is still something you can do. I mean, it's useful. It's like when we look at applications for new faculty, we do some crude quantifications of citations and you know, to cut off the 80%. You know, it's not that that's perfect, but it's practically useful, and then we're left with the 20% that we need to look into. So in exactly the same way, this is the gray and the hybrid, and I think that's this is the way this is what I see. This is I think how I see efforts of digitalization understood as quantification, both what I've talked about today, but also when I go into my healthcare examples. There was a hand.
Yes, thank you, Eric, for the insightful presentation of how quantifying real data can help us in digitalizing the industry. However, coming from the Middle East, where oil is a very heated subject in general, so I just wonder, how can we integrate, let's say, the method of digital oil in places where we have low infrastructure of data, so we can optimize the best policies in those kind of countries? So
the thing when I started off, why oil? One way of understanding what I was saying there was that I don't have a vested interest at all in oil gas. If anything, I harbor many of the concerns that I think most of us have. It has globally it has an appalling, historic track record. I mean, there are lots of things that you can say which isn't, pleasant for that industry. What I tried to express was that we can all have very mixed feelings about this as a domain, as an industry. Still, it has, that was my argument. Still, if we bracket those sentiments and just look at the phenomena, there are some interesting insights from their efforts of digitalization. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be critical to what we're doing, and so, but specifically to where lesser infrastructure, lesser resources, or less, I guess for me a main interest is in the digital. So I would that's where I'm not an oil engineer. I mean, I have very little to offer for anyone who knows their trade in that sense. So it is really when this is tied to efforts of digitalization, with emphasis on the data, and as here, by far, 90+% of the data is the IoT data. That's just the way it is and has been in the context I've looked up. I realize that's definitely not the case for all, all settings. So I guess I have less to say. I mean, have you seen this? What's her name? Actually, it's called Machineries of Oil. It's a title very close to mine. So it talks about the history of Iranian oil, Anglo-Iranian oil, BP in Iran, yeah. So it comes out in the same book series at MIT. I'm sorry, the name of the author slips my mind, but if you Google Machineries of Oil, you'll see that. So that's a history of oil in the Middle East, without my emphasis on the digital. Yes, please.
Well, Eric, thank you very much for your talk. You started saying that you have a computer science background. And in computer science, there are entire fields discussing knowledge representation, requirements engineering, modeling. How much this community could help in this journey of producing much better or accurate representations of the reality that we're trying to tell?
That's a terrific question. A lot, I think. Because of my poor timekeeping, I had to skip this thing when I wanted to really dwell on uncertainties. I think to take one example, I think in general there is much to be gained, and to sort of exemplify it with this, ways of representing uncertainties in the models and in the labeling. In the AI field, there are all kinds of different ways of representing, noisy labels. You can, do Bayesian, explicit modeling of the uncertainties. So I think, in short, that instead of doing exactly like, there was a very cryptic reference to some colleagues of us who has recently done this radiology study, because they completely, brush over all details of this. And I think instead of replicating, the crudeness in exactly, the technological sense, I would very much like to collaborate, with. So one of the projects I'm in, which I didn't get to talk about, is on explainable AI. So with them, I work with AI, different, family, they all have their, pet approach, and we test out ways of getting at explainability in some industrial and business cases. So yes, I'm very sympathetic to that. I think we do too little, and I have some small examples towards that end. But I think it's in general that there is space for so much more.
Right, thank you very much, Eric. It's a very thought-provoking presentation. Obviously, is the first step of kind of getting the hang of this phenomenon, of course. And I was especially excited to see Zubov kind of brought into the conversation. It shows my age when I started doing this. I was just wondering whether you have started seeing signs that maybe, especially explainability, is not only going to be Zubov, but we have to bring Hutchins with the distributed cognition and Star maybe with the boundary objects into the conversation. Seen any examples or evidence for that? Or?
It's similar to the last question in the sense that I see all too little. You would expect much more, results in this area of, the trade-offs, the way, explainability isn't just, coloring, we have these heat maps, are they useful? Of course you can do them, but in what context, for what purpose, under what conditions are they helpful? I think that's, quite open, and one element of that is the, how consequential are, these explanations. So, take a ridiculous example of these recommender systems and Amazon. And, so if Amazon gets it wrong and recommends a book that, I don't really care, what's the risk here? Well, I might, $10, whatever. So, the risks are minute. Whereas the, the clinical cases, the cases safety, hazard, or even, significant economic, operational, business consequences, you want more of the explanation. You have higher criteria for getting it. So what I'm saying is that, too little is done. And I think to get at it, we need to be more nuanced in, considering, a variety of approaches and technologies and ways of doing it, matched with different settings, because they are very different in all kinds of ways. And what then are the chances of uptake? The bigger story around AI is, of course, that its uptake is quite slow. Understood as organizational, real decision-making, clinical. Given the efforts and it's really startling how little, not how much, impact we're seeing. Even this radiology, go out in the radiology world, departments of Europe and look at how many of their clinical decisions are push a button, and that's not what we're seeing. So even in the areas with the most convincing, compelling, interesting results, we're still struggling with the uptake. we should spend more energy trying to sort of figure out. So, it's not a clear answer, but I sympathize with what you're saying.
But I'm not surprised we don't see results because it's a very complex distributed decision system, especially in oil and gas, as you said. I mean, your decision is made in a context of a group, and we're trying to throw maybe AI, maybe some measurement digitalization systems in there, and we haven't tuned it to the human part of the system, I guess. So,
and there is so much money being thrown at this as we speak. Yeah. Right.
Yeah, welcome to Manchester. Someone's got to ask the critical minded question. All of that with unions and resistance and solidarity.
Hit me with it.
Our Emeritus Slate Professor in Mumford from here, who focused in on mining and job satisfaction, unionisation and resistance. It doesn't seem to enter into your theoretical frame at all, which is a bit surprising, given that you talk about the great to-do box work, which influenced me massively. I probably wouldn't be in this job if I hadn't been for that book, actually. But it talks a lot about resistance and surveillance. And I read a paper that was sent to me for review. I don't know if you ever got through the process about an oil rig and about the way the oil workers were resisting in all sorts of subversive ways of putting helmets on cameras and leaving things around to stop the technology from working, to subvert the process because they didn't like it, and because it wasn't introduced properly without their participation, etc., etc., etc. And the unions were heavily involved in that. This seems to be right outside the conceptual frame.
It's a fair comment, and I'll take it as that because that was part of this the alternative narratives that for this talk I didn't I'd struggled to get covering what I had planned, but yes, you're absolutely right that that's a prominent theme and still is. I alluded to it because the issue of safety is here, I think, a very key word, because I mean, if I should try to sort of answer you directly, in the longer version, I do address this more. I do talk about it more explicitly than I had time to here. I think that it comes in when safety is tied to digitalization and has been for a long time, and still very much is connected to safety. What kind of remote operations, running of activities is safe? It's for cost-cutting reasons, moving people, reducing people, and getting them from offshore into onshore control room settings has been a key issue with the unions all the way. So there has been there are regular outcries for the safety concerns. It's this process that I'm outlining has been going too far, too fast, reckless. So there are these friction. That's definitely part of the larger story. We can't just trust this sand because there are safety concerns. We need people on the platform to do the physical. We can't reduce the manual cost cutting because there are safety concerns. This is exactly the way this conversation is unfolding. So yes, that's definitely there. Even though I acknowledge that I didn't spend much time dwelling on that here, but that is part of that story, and not in ancient history. Now, 50% of oil and gas is produced by unmanned installation, that is remotely. Is that safe? They're shifting more and more. They're doing more and more of not only the production, but all of the other activities as well. Maintenance. This has been, key arguments voiced through the unions, and it's not just one union. There are different brands here, and some come out more stronger than others. And all of this happened in a shift from getting out the Americans who were dead against the unions, and getting also the conservative government, which were in place at one point, on board with the the labor regulations. So basically tidying up the industry, having in place regimes of safety controls, but also the role of the units. So end of the story is that Norwegian offshore oil and gas is on par. The unionization is much above the level of the UK sector. It still is a stronghold of unions and their claims, but this first picture from this manual to has meant that over time there has been reduction of personnel on the platforms. They're heavy. You get extras for offshore, so you get salary top up. So it's been that's been a concern, but they've fought against it. They still are, but they haven't stopped it. So that's what I meant when I said that this hasn't been frictionless.
Any other questions?
Maybe there are questions in chat.
No, because
we're not streaming. We're not streaming.
We're just recording for the.
We tricked everyone to come, so we didn't want to stream.
I mean, we brought Eric from Norway, when he's staying home to see him virtually. But maybe I'll ask or make a comment, actually, given that there are no other comments. I really like the framing on digitalization as the quantification of quality. I like that very much, and the fact that this is attempted, it's full of errors, I guess this is something that we discussed on a separate project together, but maybe just to open up the discussion here. What's interesting for me, at least, is how that digitalization of quality is not just based on the interaction of the human decision makers with the data, but also the interaction with the algorithm itself, right? And the recommendations that the algorithm makes. So there's three elements, I guess, here. And I guess going back to Meyer's point about this point about uncertainty and complexity, and that if you add that third dimension, the uncertainty becomes even more complex, right? Because now you have to manage, I guess, the limitations of interpretation from the human side, including all the biases and the political issues and everything else that comes with it. In addition to the inconsistencies of the data, and just a side point in relation to social media versus the physical object, I think both are temporal, both have temporal uncertainties, but perhaps the social media is more ephemeral in the sense that it's instant and it's constantly changing, whereas the physical object takes a little bit more abuse before it is changed, and that adds to that temporal uncertainty adds to the conflicts of interpretation, which at the end, and again I come back to this point of quantification of quality, the quality changes. The ultimate quality of the interpretation changes.
So I think thanks for that comment, and I think there are different levels. I can it's not so much a question as the comment, but if I should comment on your comment. I think that what I want very clearly with this quantification of quality is that it's never perfect. You're never in a perfect way. I mean, that's the importance of this attempted quantification of quality. But so I think in addition to what you just said, so there are three ingredients here. I think there is also, I think, very much the setting and specifically the purpose.
Mm-hmm.
So quantification of quality isn't this, did I get did the likes get sentiment right or not? I mean, did they really nail it? But because they're never going to do that, and none of these sensors are ever going to get sand. But that's not the question. That's not the interesting question. It's obvious they'll never get it, period, full stop. But that misses the point of we live constantly with imperfections. We're quite robust in tolerating imperfections in all kinds of ways. And then when you bring that into the equation with the quantification of quality, we know that it's imperfect, but does it for particular purposes, situations, conditions, help you monitor sound? Yes, it does.
Yeah.
Yes, Brian, even though there are safety concerns and unions are sometimes quite fiercely against it, but it's still, that's I think, so purpose has to come strongly into it, because otherwise you end up with, did we really get it? Does 10 degrees centigrade, does that really capture the old time when temperature was quality? It was comfortable, it was warm, it was cold, it was Manchester weather.
Eric, quick question on this dimension of quality. In digitalization, we start looking at real world things, phenomena. We start creating representations of these realities that are imperfect, as you said, captured with sensors, and we start manipulating these representations. Then the reality itself starts getting diluted in this process of transformation. And then quality itself starts degrading. So what is it going back to the original instruments? Is it thinking about the process itself? Where do you put some checkpoints? Because the risk is what you end up with is so detached from the reality that it loses all meaning.
I agree, and here I don't have all the answers. I take inspiration from one of my colleagues who looked at modeling of climate change, Paul Edwards, and if you read his work, they're all the models are always wrong. And even the data is wrong, because the old temperature readings we discovered today that this the thermometer was off calibration, which means that not only this reading but going back X years was wrong. And so that's the material for climate science. Still, policies are made, decisions are made. So where do we end? Well, I think we end in this. There isn't a way to get that climate change in an unmediated, direct sense. In the same way, there is no way to get that my reservoirs. You are only, mediated through these models and data and all of that. I tend to take a fairly sort of optimistic view, in the sense that I think we as humans and decision makers are quite up to grappling with. We don't curl up and cry when you know, that's the climate, here's the model and it's wrong, and what now to do? I mean, it's complete, you know, I can't do anything. Well, you know, it's life. That's what, you know, and science is life. They're, you know, only the most naive, you know, descriptions of scientists and what they do portray them as you know, they, so we you know, like this example of the reservoirs, they have, you know, competing models, they know they're wrong, and then, you know, if it gets uncomfortably wrong, then we do redo it. But there are investments in the model we have, so we stick with it up to a certain point, but then, you know, we can't be bothered. So that's, I think, that's where we're heading, and to me, that's, we are well prepared and equipped to cope with that, because in contrast to many of the algorithms we portray, we're quite good at coping with these differences and inconsistencies.
Thank you. I think we need to bring it to a stop there. And thank you, Eric, again for. And just want to say tomorrow we'll have the PhD workshop. So we only have 2 volunteer PhD students. If any one of you wants to just give, it's an informal talk. You don't need to give a presentation, but Eric would be happy to give feedback to your work. So if you're undecided still, please come anyway. And it's going to be a very informal session, interactive, you know, listen to ideas, and maybe you get some feedback that would help you restructure your thinking.
If I can just,
Yes.
yeah. So yes, informal. So, you know, we, you know, pitching some of your ideas, and then, you know, 10 minutes, and then possibly, you know,